So one of the things I've been noticing, we've been to a couple of clinical meetings recently, and ADCs are everywhere. They remain everywhere. There's been a real resurgence. But talking to clinicians, talking to patient advocates, it still seems the case that the ADCs aren't delivering quite in the way we hoped they would. We're not getting the selectivity. We're still seeing on-target toxicity through systemic release, and it just feels we're not getting the patient benefit that was promised from ADCs through maybe lack of stability or non-selective delivery of the payload. We're still focusing on cytotoxic payloads. So, I mean, Josh, from what you're seeing, where are we going?
I think you're right. I think if we look at the clinical landscape at the moment, we've pretty much taken a antibody conjugated to a drug approach. And now I think what we're seeing really evolve is this ADC as its own modality approach. We've been lacking on innovation within the payload world or the linker world. And what we're seeing now is really thinking about each of the compartments and pulling them all together and creating this iterative cycle in which we can evolve the payload, the linker, the conjugate, and the antibody to make it a really fit for purpose modality. And we increase the selectivity. We hopefully increase the patient outcome. So
I think that's a really important point. I think one of the senses I get is if you talk to patients who are on these therapies, actually the side effect profile they're seeing is not that dissimilar to just dosing with the cytotoxic itself. You've got the challenges of delivery, you've got the challenges of compliance, you've got the challenges of cost for whoever's paying for these drugs. It just feels that we need a new way of thinking about these. I think it's difficult to justify. Why would you use an ADC above a small molecule cytotoxic at the moment? Because the patient perspective seems to be that the side effects are just as bad taking the ADC as they are with the straight cytotoxic, and yet all the other complexities. It does feel as though we're almost poised for an ADC revolution. I'm not sure whether we're on version 2 or version 3 by now for ADCs. That doesn't seem clear. But I do get the sense that idea of thinking about a holistic idea of an ADC, not just an antibody with some cytotoxic thing bolted on, seems to be the way that the field is heading.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at the way we build small molecules at the moment, we profile the PD, we profile the PK, we build in that selectivity into a small molecule as well as the efficacy. If we look at an antibody drug conjugate the way it is at the moment, we build the selectivity into the antibody. We don't build the selectivity into the payload. And I think that's something that really needs to change quite quickly. And we are seeing this with different things coming through the markets and coming through the clinic at the moment. It's building selectivity into multiple parts of the molecule.
Because it seems to be selectivity that these antibodies are failing on. We've seen 2 antibody drug conjugates withdrawn from the market recently due to that toxicity issue. The patients are reporting, while a clinician maybe says, well, okay, it's a tolerable grade 3, grade 4 adverse event. What a clinician thinks is tolerable does not seem to be what a patient thinks is tolerable. And I think you're right, moving toward that more holistic approach will hopefully give us that quality of life benefit that patients are looking for, because I just get the sense that antibody drug conjugates at the moment are not delivering that quality of life.
I really think you're right there. I think what we're seeing is the whole industry within its infancy at the moment. We are building selectivity into the molecules, but we are only building selectivity into the ADC. And it's almost like okay, we've delivered the drug, let's wipe our hands clean and we'll move on. We're not thinking about the metabolic profile of the drugs. We're not thinking about the off-target tox. I mean, these are highly cytotoxic molecules that are now floating around the peripheral blood, and we need to understand exactly where they go, what they do. And we're seeing things like Blenrep coming off the market for exactly that reason. And we need to think about it a bit more in depth and take a bit more of an SAR approach, if to use a small molecule medchem term, but really thinking about how each part of the molecule interacts as an ADC itself.
It's a really interesting concept, though, isn't it? Because we've been working in the ADC space now for over 20 years. We've got 15, 16 drugs on the market. And yet, in many ways, it still feels like it's a field in its infancy, because we're still focused just on 2 or 3 potent cytotoxic payloads. And it just feels like the whole area is ripe for expansion in that space.
I think we are seeing this change quite quickly now. We're seeing large pharma and biotechs both working on really selective and really novel payloads that are looking fantastic in preclinical and moving into the clinic now. I think one of the issues that we are still seeing is obviously the off-target tox. And I think because the industry has evolved so rapidly over such a short period, even though it's 20 years, it feels like it's moved a lot faster than that. I mean, from Kadcyla, we've pretty much put 13 drugs on the market. in the last 5 or 6 years. And the issue that we see is that people are piggybacking off the things that have already gone into the market and assuming that that is going to be okay because it's already in the market. Blenrep was a bit different because obviously it was an MMAF, but it was still an auristatin inhibitor. And I think, if anything, it just shows that we don't fully understand the field as much as what we should do. But with payload the design and development coming forward and being thought of really in depth, we're now seeing that evolve a lot faster, or potentially with much better outcomes as well.
And it feels to me that that's where we go in the future. I think back to the point you made earlier about we focus on the antibody. It feels like we're starting to think now a bit more holistically about the antibody drug conjugate. We're talking about the whole thing. It's not just let's build an antibody that's selective as a delivery mechanism, but we're now thinking much more about the linker chemistry, the linker stability, the payload release, whether it's intracellular or extracellular. We're thinking about the payload. I think, the analogy that you and I have talked about previously is the delivery van analogy. We've always focused on how the van delivers the package to where you want it to get to. We've not really focused about the bit that actually is really exciting, which is the package itself. What are we actually delivering to that tumor cell? Beyond oncology, we're starting to see movement now in inflammation and immunology, potentially even CNS for ADCs, actually thinking about what package are we delivering, and also that intimate balance between how the package, the linker, and the antibody all contribute to the overall physicochemical properties, the PK, the tissue penetration. It feels like we're on the cusp of almost a whole new world of ADCs.
Yeah, I agree. I think, what's really nice to be able to see, particularly with the movement into new disease states, is we're really seeing mechanism of action being identified as something that's new. So if we look at immunomodulators, we look at things that can turn an M1 macrophage into an M2 macrophage. That's not a cytotoxic payload anymore. That's actually a completely new mechanism of action. And we're seeing things exactly the same with the CNS field. And even the metabolic field is now becoming prevalent within the ADC field. So we're really seeing things evolve quite quickly. And it's all down to this thinking about the mechanism of action. Do we need to kill this cell? Or can we just change the pathway slightly so that we can actually change the whole disease state? And I think that's really powerful.
It's an interesting new world, and it's going to require us rethinking the ADC landscape. It's going to require a whole new skill set in terms of how do we discover and develop those ADCs. But yeah, interesting times ahead.
Yeah, absolutely.